I have not talked, because of the shortage of time, about some underlying fundamental assumptions, the givens, let's say, of general semantics. And we should remind ourselves of that. One is the process character of the nonverbal world, that everything that we know anything about is an event. It's constantly happening. And of course, that's represented by the parabola. So perhaps that's the most important thing I think we could say about the event level is precisely that we assert, based on modern physics, that whatever is going on constitutes an event. The table that you're writing on is a happening. Mad dense electrons, so forth and so on. And Krzyzewski observed, of course, as you're familiar with, that human beings are the time-binding class of life, and the tool of time-binding is language.
Don't the Navajo Indians talk about things in process rather than event form?
Yes, apparently so, according to Worf's analysis of their language. The Hopi particularly, I think. From Worf's point of view, the Hopi are sort of natural Einsteinians. Their language itself is a language of process, and everything for them is discussed in terms of flow. Yeah. Now, Krzyzewski observed that, again, his observations are primarily focused on the Indo-European languages, the ones that he knew, 7 or 8 of which he knew fluently and could speak and write it and so forth. His observation was that the language that we use, which is our most important tool for time binding, that is accumulating data, building cultures, passing this on to subsequent generations. Yes? Okay. That this language is very important. It's what allows us to bind time, but we might find that some of the problems that we get into are related to the very structure of this language that we use. So in examining this language, he asserted that while what we call reality is constantly in process, that the structure of our language leads us, by and large, to have static expectations. And since language and so-called reality meet precisely in the human brain, he felt that the tension created by the process character of reality and our static ways of representing it to ourselves, that the tension between those two, since it comes together in the brain, is bound to lead to pathological behavior in varying degrees. Perhaps one of the most brilliant conclusions, I think, that he drew. Now, it seems to be this notion of time binding, that the central role that language plays in our functioning, and this conflict between the dynamic character of the nonverbal world and our relatively static ways of representing it to ourselves and to each other, these are at the heart of general semantics. If you want to know, if somebody says, well, why bother with this stuff, it seems to me this is the place to point to. Because if this insight is correct, that is terrifically important, that we examine the structure of our language and our own personal way with language, to see if maybe in that we can discover the source of a lot of the difficulties that we seem to have. Well, we're constantly talking to ourselves, and what we say to ourselves through neuro-linguistic feedback that we discussed yesterday, represented by the returning arrow, and since language is experienced by us as nervous system activities, electrochemical firings and so forth, we can very easily become entrapped by our language habits. Our culture is by and large a linguistic affair, isn't it? even the technology to say, well, this is not language, but obviously this kind of stuff, smelted and processed and all that sort of thing, could not have happened, could not have been produced except by a class of life that is able to communicate through language. The engineers who built this had to go to school, and most of our education is in the form of having symbols presented to us. So an important question becomes, how free are we? You and I have been for 2 days now concerned with trying to get more insights into the relationship between language and the world, our own habits with language, and a very important question, it seems to me, is how free are we to do anything about this? Can we become aware of it? Can it make any difference? From the general semantics point of view, the central, or the first stage of the process must be the achievement of consciousness of abstracting. Now, when Korzybski was first starting his work in the early 1920s, after he decided to remain in America, he came here in 1915, as you probably know, and was working he came originally as a member of a Russian military mission. There were many Poles in the Russian army at that time. And as a military expert, he was in Canada, and then when the Russian regime collapsed in the face of the revolution of 1917, he joined the Polish-French military commission, and eventually wound up doing some work for the United States government, selling Liberty bonds and things like that. And finally, after all that experience, decided that he would remain in the Western Hemisphere, and then started working on his books. A person who helped him a lot, particularly with the Englishing of his book, The Manhood of Humanity, which has a very nice rolling Victorian kind of style, which is more attributable to Cassius Kaiser than Korzybski, as far as the style is concerned. Kaiser was a mathematical philosopher who worked at Columbia University and wrote, among other important books, a book called Mathematical Philosophy. In fact, I really should have it on the bibliography, and was an early encourager of Korzybski. And Kaiser was very much interested in the problem of human freedom. How free are we to think? Are we strictly determined in that area? Are we to be understood strictly as sort of a set of knee-jerk kind of reflexes in the thinking area? And he formulated what he called logical fate. And which I prefer to call logical determinism, to avoid that rather popular word fate, because I think that, like the word mind, it just suggests too many fuzzy things. But he was concerned to discover what the relationship was between premises and conclusions, and he concluded from premises, conclusions follow. Once the premise was in place, there was a very tight, inescapable connection between the premise and conclusions that could be drawn from it. Now this could be diagrammed very simply in this way. Let's say P1, and we have conclusion sub 1. And he asserted that there's no freedom here, that from certain premises, certain conclusions must be drawn, or that certain premises will lead inevitably to certain conclusions. So I said, if you're concerned about freedom in thinking, the area then to concentrate on, to take a look at, is precisely here. What are your premises? What are the underlying assumptions that you make, which we're largely unconscious of, that generate the conclusions that you reach? And he concluded that we are free to do that. It isn't easy, but he felt that this was an area of at least relative freedom, partial freedom. We can examine our premises. If we find that the premise is unacceptable because we have new information, Maybe somebody tells us something that we didn't know before, or if it's in the scientific area, maybe there's a new discovery that someone reports, then we're in a position to try to change that premise. He also observed that you can't reach a different conclusion as long as this initial premise is still in place. Okay? The thing that's necessary is to change the premise, and then this is the free area to shift from one premise to another. At that point, Kaiser asserted logical fate takes over again, and with a new premise, you automatically leads to new conclusions. So in a sense, he's suggesting a way that we can make use of this kind of inevitability in a free way, provided we can become aware of our premises and perhaps make new ones to fit new data. Well, Krzyzewski was much more interested in behavior than in just logical processes. He, of course, read a lot in that area, but as you know, general semantics is not a system of logic or mathematical logic or anything of that sort, although a lot of what we talk about derives from some of those studies. He was primarily interested in human evaluating and the behavior that stems from that. So in effect, he modified Kaiser's discussion and diagram and said from premises, behaviors follow. And he observed that, as with the strictly logical concerns of Kaiser, whatever we do derives from the premises that we have as part of our equipment in our heads. And if we want to understand what we're doing, why we do a certain thing, it's necessary for us to make the effort to discover what our underlying assumptions are. We use the example of the paranoid schizophrenic, so-called, and very important for any person like that, if he's going to be helped at all, it's very difficult to do, not to simply criticize his behavior or try to force a change from behavior 1 to behavior 2. We can do that momentarily. Apparently B.F. Skinner can do it for a pretty long time with pigeons and critters of that sort. But from the human point of view, Krzyzewski asserted that attempts to simply force changes of behavior, if successful, will be very short-term. And the results will be very short-term. So we need to, with, let's say, the paranoid schizophrenic, to try to get that person to examine, let's say, the classical assumption is that everyone is hostile and out to get me. As long as the person is that premise is in place, it makes a lot of sense for the paranoid person to defend himself, doesn't it? In other words, that's quite reasonable behavior related to the premise. Another example, it's not fair to Skinner, and I'm not relating to him, is from the societal point of view. We try to do that very often. Let's say a person is committing the behavior called armed robbery, and we change the person's behavior by putting him in a cage with very often other armed robbers. And of course that modifies the behavior immediately. But what happens after the person gets out is that they're usually a little more sophisticated in armed robbery than they were before, because they've been to school in armed robbery. So, and of course the whole notion of rehabilitation in prisons, it seems to me, works on that assumption. Well, now that we have the person here, we've changed his behavior all right. He can't go out and rob banks, and now we're going to try to work on him to see if he will change his premises. Well, as we know, the track record in that area is extremely poor. But again, that's a good enrichment of what we're saying here. Surely it can be attempted in that way too. it seems to me this kind of thing is very useful for us as individuals. For our own thinking, I assume that people who are interested in general semantics are interested in becoming more aware, not only of what they're doing, but of why they're doing what they're doing. And very often are concerned with trying to examine their own functioning in such a way that they can try to become aware of their underlying premises, the assumptions that they make. We've had several exercises to work at that. And I'm simply suggesting this as a very simple, handy way to a model that you can use to promote your own consciousness of abstracting. The kind of maybe pessimistic aspect of this is this notion of this determined relationship. The optimistic aspect of it, from the Kaiser-Krzyzewski formulation point of view, is that if we can become aware of the premises, we are free to change those premises, and if we do indeed internalize the new premises, new behaviors, new conclusions, behaviors related to that will automatically follow. Now let's not be simple about that or naive. We know, many of us who have worked at ourselves from the point of view of general semantics, that after years and years and years, we still wind up doing all kinds of stupid things. We still jump to conclusions. We make inferences which are inappropriate. So I think it's very important that we not imply that there's a kind of an almost a panacea or magical effect that will flow from our attempts to perhaps modify ourselves with relation to the formulations of general semantics. It takes work, but I guess what we could say is that this is at least the minimum necessary condition that must be present if any reevaluating and restructuring of behavior is going to occur. Any further comments about that? Now it seems to me this is kind of the engine that runs general semantics. I don't know why we would be interested in general semantics if we were not concerned with trying to do this kind of thing. Changing our premises. We have absorbed many, many premises from our upbringing, from the culture as a whole. We evaluate some of those as being inappropriate. We try to find out which ones they may be and try to formulate new premises which will eventuate in changes and hopefully the sanitization of the culture. Now we've seen already in our discussions, we're here to examine language and reality and behavior relationships, the central concern of general semantics. And in the process of doing that, we find that we're having the kind of problems that we have come to discuss. There have been several occasions in our discussions back and forth where it became quite clear that we were using, say, a given term, but having quite different responses to that term. And that difference in the way we're responding to the term led to difficulties, and we had to keep working at it until we could straighten it out. Now, in a kind of a laboratory environment like this, it's relatively easy to do that because we're all kind of set to be conscious of what we're saying and how we're saying it and what the what the implications are and so forth. In day-to-day living, of course, and the excitement of just interacting with other people, it's quite much more difficult to become aware of that, to do anything about it. So I'd like to discuss now the problem that we can put under the heading of multi-meaning of terms. And I want to distinguish between multi-meaning, which we might call horizontal differences in words, from multiordinality, which we can call the vertical differences. And we can distinguish three kinds of multi-meaning: lexical, contextual, and neurological. Now, by lexical, I simply mean that if we look the word up in a dictionary and see what its standard use is, we will find that on the average, most English words have at least three different uses, each of which is standard, legitimate, and not the expression of some kind of confusion on the part of the speakers. So here we're concerned with the kind of stuff that's recorded in dictionaries. We can put it this way: same word, different definition. But even after it, of course, you've had this experience many times. You may perhaps come across a word that you're not sure of. You look it up in a dictionary, there are a string of definitions. What do you still have to do with it? Yeah, you're still in the position of having to make a choice from among these definitions related to the way the word's being used in a given context. So we can put there same word, different situation. The third source of multi-meaning and the confusions that can derive from that is neurological. We know, and we're going to demonstrate this in just a second or two, we know that even after you and I interact in a nice, sane way, very calmly, and we agree on which use of the word we're discussing, and we understand the context in which the word is being used, we still have somewhat different responses as nervous systems to the word. So here we can say same word, different brain. And what I would like to urge here is that operationally speaking, or functionally speaking, there ain't no such thing as the same word, if we mean it in an absolute sense. Now, within degrees of tolerance, sure, otherwise we couldn't communicate at all. But very often, while we're nodding our heads in agreement, we are in effect agreeing about different things. Let's demonstrate this with a very simple little exercise. I'm going to tell you a story. And I want you to, as you hear each sentence of the story, just 5 sentences, I want you to jot down whatever happens in your head. If you see a picture of some sort, put a few words down so you remember what that image was. If your response may be other words in your head that are triggered by what I say. If that's the case, just jot that down so that after we've done the story, you'll be able to tell me and each other what it is, what got triggered in your head. Okay, is that clear? Please do not write down what I say. I don't want you to write the story down. I want you to write whatever you become aware of with relation to the statement that I make. All right? Here's the story. I have a friend. You're not supposed to look surprised. That's not a legitimate reaction, not allowable. All right, I have a friend. My friend has a very nice house. Okay. Nothing happening, huh? The house is used primarily for vacations. One of the nicest features of the house is that it's located near water, which you may already have done. Perhaps the nicest feature of the house is the patio. That's it. No Pulitzer Prize for that one. Is there anyone who did not understand the story? Good. At least that's your claim. Would someone like to be willing to repeat it? Not necessarily verbatim, but to the satisfaction of the group that say, yeah, that's basically what you said. Could somebody do that? Yes.
I have a friend. My friend has a very nice house. It's used primarily for vacation. It's located near the water. Nice. That's the nicest feature there.
Okay. Does that sound all right? Everybody agree with that?
Yep.
Terrific. Okay, 40-some people. Once again, one of those red letter occasions. Mark it on your calendar. We agree. Rather trivial thing to agree on, but let's cherish it anyway. Don't get too many of these. All right, let's get some notion of what we agreed on, or what we seem to be agreeing on. And now I'd like to hear some of the recordings of what happened in your head. Walt, what about you? What happened when I said I have a friend?
I put down pal.
Okay. Did you picture anyone? Any person?
No.
Okay. How about when I said my friend has a very nice house?
I just put down big house.
Okay. And vacation?
Yeah, someone switched to A-frame.
Okay. He wasn't that well off, huh?
Big A-frame.
Big A. Okay, big A-frame. And the water?
Swimming.
And the patio?
Barbecue.
Let's take a look at this. This is what we agreed on a few moments ago. Okay? And I know of no escape from this. And what you can't escape from, it seems to me, you have to simply accept. But if you do accept this, and you're in the position, say, of giving instructions, or you're supervisor of a department or something like this, you know that you just can't be satisfied with even hearing your subordinate repeat the instructions. You now have an obligation to monitor the performance, because you know damn right well that the listener has supplied a whole lot of data out of his or her own experience, which may or may not be relevant, but in any case is going to greatly individualize the response. Okay, and this is what I have in mind when I talk about neurological multi-meaning. No way out. Let's recognize, too, that this is pretty superficial. I mean, this is just what you were able to be immediately aware of. We have to also include the rest of the iceberg, which would be all of those responses, all of those elements, let's say, that you're adding to the information that you're not aware of, and that you probably could not become aware of, even through your own efforts. Maybe you would have to be regressed or something through hypnosis, making use of neuro-linguistic feedback mechanisms. I might mention that some of us saw Dr. Michael Dean's show yesterday, in which he has a hypnosis act, and very, very well done, very clever, very extremely interesting, and whatever we might say about hypnosis and its use in entertainment and so forth, struck me as a terrific demonstration of the power, of the impact of neurolinguistic feedback, where basically all the man was doing was saying words in a particular way, repetitively, insistently, and so forth, and out of something like, what was it, about maybe 20 people you had on the stage initially, or 25 or so, out of that, a good 10 or so demonstrated markedly changed behavior because of those words that he was saying, and of course the way that they internalized them for themselves. Fantastic demonstration of what the implications of the arrow may be. And now, please turn the cassette over for the start of side B. Now, I mentioned, I think, on Friday night that some people like to define culture as a shared hallucination. And one thing that seems to be that as general semanticists we should think about with relation to ourselves is the self-hypnotic effect that our talking to ourselves has on us. We constantly are reinforcing what we already have said before and keep ourselves in various verbal boxes. Be aware. We're not talking about going into some kind of trance or anything of that sort. Simply being aware of the environment and reactions that we're having and so forth, but trying not to talk to ourselves about it. Trying not to be giving ourselves instructions or reprimands or congratulations. Many people find that when they try this sort of thing, they might just for a moment feel that they've experienced a moment or two, it could be very impactful, of silence. And then immediately they hear the little voice in their heads congratulating them for having achieved silence. So the tape is running all the time, and it's very difficult to stop, but very, very restful to just get off of that stuff, even for seconds at a time. Another value of that kind of exercise, of course, is that you can take the time to become aware of the content of the tape, which we're running constantly in our heads. If we don't do that sort of thing, it seems to be just about impossible to become aware of the large amount of nonsense that every one of us is telling ourselves constantly. Now, we know neurophysiologically, of course, not surprising, since these words in our nervous systems are related to electrocolloidal structures. The neural impulses are electrochemical in nature or in character. It's not surprising that this has effects. From premises, behaviors follow. I suppose the most dramatic indication of this electrocolloidal connection between words, which are not neutral, and behaviors is that famous self-induced hole in the stomach that we call an ulcer. Of course, we know the stomach has hydrochloric acid in it, and when there's food present, more of that is secreted, and the food gets digested. Sometimes we tell ourselves very harsh, negative things. I'm a prize schnook, whatever it might be. And apparently one of the responses to that is the secretion of hydrochloric acid into the stomach. However, now there's no food to be digested, so we digest our stomachs, or partially. And of course we wind up with an ulcer. That seems to be the mechanism involved there. We also mentioned that, and this is, I remember seeing this in Science News, I guess about 20 years ago, very well established, that with relation to stressful states, and again, many of these stressful states produced by our internal monologue, there is an increased flow of acid in the mouth. which promptly proceeds to start dissolving enamel. There have been many statements. In fact, there's a famous statement by Alfred Tarski, who is a semanticist, as opposed to a general semanticist. We'll talk about that a little later, too, who was very, very concerned that no one confuse his work with general semantics. And he made a famous statement that semantics is simply a modest scholarly discipline that is not designed to be a cure for dental caries and things of that sort. And we know who he was talking about. Well, it was a mistake on his part to think that this kind of little put-down sort of statement would hold. He simply didn't have enough information. So what I'm trying to stress here again is the non-neutral character of language, the very direct organismic connections between whatever it is that we say and our state at a given time. One of Krzyzewski's most original contributions in the what we might call the linguistic aspects of general semantics is the notion of multiordinality. When I think about this, and I think back of the 4 years that I spent at a Jesuit college studying scholastic philosophy and having all kinds of good disputes and things of that sort, I'm really appalled at what an impact awareness of the multiordinality of terms would have had on those discussions. It may have turned out that we wouldn't have been able to have them at all, which probably would have been very good for all of us. We mean several things by the formulation of multiordinality. Krzyzewski observed that many of the terms that we use can, for starters, be used at different orders of abstracting or levels. He used the terms orders and levels interchangeably. Some of us who are working in the field, at least around the Institute, have an increasing preference for the term order because it seems less committed to the kind of latter sort of notion. All right, multi-ordinal terms can be used at different orders of abstracting. But, and here's the source of confusion, if we're not aware of this, and yet the source of richness of these multi-ordinal terms, no change in the dictionary meaning, by and large.
Is this the vertical that you're talking
Yes, right. This would be what we might call vertical multimeaning. Okay. No change in the dictionary meaning, but with definite changes in the functional meaning. Another way to say this is that the meaning, let's put it this way, is a function of the level of abstracting that we're concerned with. The meaning is a function of context, but in this case, the primary context is the level of abstracting at which the word is being used. Now, when we talk about the level of abstraction or abstracting at which the term is being used, we don't have to try and be concerned with, say, is that, let's see, you just use that word, is it at this level, you know, or this one? We don't have to get caught up in a almost spastic attempt at formalism within our daily intercourse. Very often, multi-ordinal terms can be applied to themselves, and we have to watch the language here. And we'll put themselves in quotes. You could use that as a kind of a test for a multi-ordinal term, if you want to see if you're using a multi-ordinal term. For example, Can you have a communication about communication? Okay. That indicates that we're using a multi-ordinal term. The term communication can be used at any level. But each time it's used, if the level shifts, what the word is referring to changes. So that's why we say there's a shift in the functional meaning of the term, although at each level, if you decided to go and look at the dictionary, you would run into the same definition. There wouldn't be any change there. Well, let's take a few examples. One that Krzyzewski uses is the term hate. And he observed that with multi-ordinal terms, if we're not aware of them, we can have great confusion because we confuse orders of abstracting. If we are aware of them, it greatly increases our vocabulary. But we have to be aware that we're using a term that the functional vocabulary is increased because this same noise or symbol can be plugged in at many, many different levels. He also observed, as a function of this notion that the terms can be applied to themselves, that they seem to almost follow the algebraic law of signs. And there's an interesting discussion of this in Harry Weinberg's book, Levels of Knowing and Existence. If we, for example, assign a minus value to hate, we might say that if we're going to overcome our hatred, we have to learn to hate the hate. Okay, so let's call this first order hate, and if we apply to that what we could call second order hate, we have minus applied to a minus equals what? Okay. Now we don't want to overdo this. It's just an intriguing thing. Where did algebra come from? Where does all of this stuff happen that we're talking about? Yeah. Algebra came out of brains, didn't it? It's an invention. It's not surprising that we should see relationships. That's something that happens in algebra, which is just another language, a shorthand way of stating relationships of various kinds. Not too surprising that we do in our vernacular things that are similar to what happens in algebra, since after all they are both products of human nervous systems. How about love? Can I love love? Okay, it must be a multi-ordinal term. If I experience first order love, I say there's something going on here and I have this feeling of love. Love that. And then because I'm aware and I can abstract to indefinite orders, I can say, I love the fact that I love that thing that I'm abstracting. Well, if I assign a plus value to love, and I assign second order love to the first order love, algebraically, what would the result be? Still plus, isn't it? No, it's a plus. No, that's just a leftover thing from before. Right, so plus times plus gives us, so we can have an enhancing effect. I think for me, from a practical point of view, where the awareness of the multi-ordinality of terms is most useful is precisely in political and philosophical and scientific kinds of discussions. Just to have a generalized awareness that just because the word is reappearing, that it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing that it meant at a previous point in the text. It may well be referring to quite different levels and therefore quite different realities than it was being used to refer to before. One of the big multi-ordinal terms that we use in general semantics is the term structure. Does this represent some structure? This, so on, so on, so on, so on. Can we structure a structure? Sure. Are you attempting to structure yourselves as structures? Yeah. One of the things we get into in general semantics is a very conscious self-participation in building ourselves to be however it is that we think we would like to be. Okay. Now, when I use the term structure, then I have to have some notion of approximately what I'm referring to along here. Otherwise, I'm going to have a very confused discussion. We can take an example. Let's suppose that this represents something going on, and this represents an artist. And the artist is observing something, abstracting from it. And we have these two structures, but they are also, their relationship constitutes the structure. Okay? Krzyzewski defines structure as a complex of relations. Very simple definition. Does anybody see the connection between that and his statement, which personally I had to work on for about 3 years? It must have been the same time I was looking for that definition of color. His famous statement, structure is the only content of knowledge. Anybody familiar with that statement? Suppose that I could find something that was unitary in the sense that it was not made up of components, so-called. You have to be careful about that word component. But let's suppose that I could. Let's suppose that this were some kind of structure such that, well, we would say maybe it's not a structure. Because it's unitary. It's not divisible. It's not, like the old Greek idea of the atom. Suppose I could find that and observe it. Would it still be legitimate to say that structure is the only content of knowledge? Why?
Because the only way that you could observe anything about it is in its relationship to something else.
Namely?
Yourself.
Yeah. The ultimate structure from which there is no appeal. Any observation, joint product of the observer and the observed. A joint product. A structure. So if I'm observing something, even if it were this imaginary unitary something, which we have never found, but even if I had that, my knowledge of it would still be the expression of minimally this structure. Something here and my interaction with it. Very important because it points to the non-essentialist character of general semantics. Recently, people have been asking me about questions about the connection between general semantics and phenomenology. And you'll be happy to hear we're not going to talk about that. But we can say just very briefly that probably the primary difference is that general semantics is non-essentialist. That is to say, in general semantics, we give up the age-old human pursuit for essences, for getting to know the thing in itself. Good Lord, how much mischief has been generated because people thought they knew the essential thing about something. And of course, if you have the essence of it, and other people don't express themselves in a similar way, there's something very wrong with them. Minimally, we say they just can't see. Even so fine a person as Jacques Maritain flatly asserted that some people just seem to be particularly adept at penetrating to the essences of things. And of course, he modestly included himself among those people. Very characteristic of probably the majority of people on the planet Earth that do that kind of thing. Yeah, but what is it? What is it? And can we nail it down and say the final thing about it? If structure is the only content of knowledge, and we assert that, it's not the kind of thing that you sort of prove, except in the sense that we just stated that our knowledge is always a joint product of whatever it is that we're observing plus ourselves. If you accept that, then you could have a very relaxed life. in the sense that at least you don't get yourself on crazy hobby horses and start galloping around the universe trying to find the plug of the universe. What the essentialist claims is that he can disregard his own participation in the discovery process. All right, and that's why I said that's madness. But having just been cured, don't be too confident about it. I would like to suggest that we're all very strongly essentialist in our attitudes. We behave as though we may philosophically say, well, of course that's foolish. We all know that everything we know is a joint product of ourselves and whatever it is that we're talking about. We're all sophisticated. Heck, we know that. And then we get into a conversation and say, that guy's so stupid. I mean, he just doesn't see the way this thing really is. You know, I see it, but he can't see it. And so our behavior outside of a calm, evaluating context such as this indicates that we are quite primitive still. And we're involved in that essential, the quest for the one, the true, the good, the beautiful, instead of for the ones and the goods and the trues and the beautifuls. Okay, lots of ways to skin a cat. All right, fine. I don't want to say at this point anything more about multiordinality of terms. Does anyone have any questions about just what the term, how we use the term within general semantics? Does that seem clear? All right, fine. I'd like to go on to another very important formulation. Non-elementalism. Perhaps we can even relate it to what we were just talking about. Now, by elementalism, Korzybski formulated the notion that with words we've split what can't be found split at nonverbal levels. Okay, so we verbally split Okay, once again referring to our handy-dandy semantic rosary, as some people supposedly called it in the 30s. With our language, we split up. We make all kinds of splits which don't exist as near as we can tell at a given date at this level. Okay? Practical, well, let me just say a little more about that, but then I want to say something about what could have been, I think, an extremely valuable book, and still is in some ways, but for my purposes was greatly, the value of it was greatly vitiated by the failure to be aware of the non-elementalism formulation and to apply it in the book, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But let's see a couple of famous examples of elementalistic splits that we say we have to overcome. We've already talked about this one. Observer and observed. Okay. And we have been at some pains in general semantics to say there ain't no such split. Never any observation except by some observer. And whatever gets observed is a joint product of the observer and the observed. The correction for that in general semantics is the use of the extensional device, the hyphen. The hyphen was introduced by Korzybski as just a simple way to join what our language has mistakenly split. Another famous one is space and time. In Newtonian physics, we split space and time. There are lots of discussions about time as a separate entity and space as something separate. The Einsteinian view, which Krzyzewski absorbed, is that there ain't no such split. Never any spatial experiences except at some time. No experience of what we call time except as a function of some spatial structure of some sort. In addition to the classical three of length, width, depth, and so forth, we must also include the time at which the measurement was made. Now that's terrifically important in the physics of very fine processes and in the concern for exploring the universe. How far is the moon from the Earth?
What time of the month?
Yeah, okay. The first question has to be when. How far is the moon from the Earth? When. So it's a function of space-time. It isn't some fixed distance. The distance is a variable, a function of time. So that's extremely important awareness to have if you're going to try to land on the moon. You know, it's coming here, you better aim here. And in fact, what happens, of course, we call it a rendezvous, don't we? The two come together, the spaceship and the moon, both as moving structures join up at a given point. Well, there's another area where this space-time formulation is extremely important. Anybody have any suggestion about that one? Very close to home.
When you describe how you feel.
Yeah. Right here. Are you a space-time event? Now, if you think of yourself only spatially, think of yourself simply as some kind of unit without an awareness of the process character, that is the temporal aspects of yourself. You may just have the shock one day of looking in the mirror. You're shaving. If you're somebody like me and you shave, who the hell is that middle-aged banana salesman? Christ almighty, it's me. Okay. The process character of reality is very importantly focused in this notion of space-time. I saw on public television during the Einstein centennial a very entertaining discussion of Einstein's life and work with Peter Ustinov playing a kind of bumbling everyman. He was confused about everything. And he did a very good job of portraying a Newtonian stumbling around in the Einsteinian universe. Nigel Calder, who's a very good science writer, wrote the script, and I was very disturbed. Seriously disturbed. I really thought it was a very bad move. They started off by talking about space-time and all that, and they said, however, they reached the point, now we're going to examine these things, and then they proceeded to spend about 20 minutes on space, and then a subsequent 20 minutes on time. Fantastic. And as far as I was concerned, they just prevented the viewers from coming into the 20th century by doing that. So these linguistic habits are very, very embedded, deeply embedded, very hard to change. From my point of view, although I cannot claim to be an expert in Einsteinian physics and cosmology and all that, but as near as I was able to tell, they gave out a terrific amount of misinformation on that show precisely because they maintained this split. If you talk about space separately and time separately, I just don't know how you can explain Einsteinian notions. Okay? Well, okay. Let's take another famous split. Or thoughts. That way. Feelings and thoughts. We've recently had some difficulty perfectly normal in educational activities. You have people, different staff members working together, and sometimes somebody seems to be doing something that seems to be inappropriate within the particular discipline. And recently we had a situation where a staff member at an institute seminar was leading people through exercises in which they were being encouraged to sort of spot statements that they made as feelings or thoughts. What the hell are we doing? No, we say in general semantics that there is no such split. There is never a so-called thought, an intellection, without affective components, and no feelings that are not tied in with some kind of thinking or intellection. Even to talk about these things becomes difficult because we're so accustomed to thinking of them separately that it makes the discussion sound almost a little bit strange. Is there a question or comment? Yes.
Yeah, well, the psychologists, some psychologists are always separating emotional from intellectual.
Yes. Very, very deeply embedded in the culture, very, very common. And we do it ourselves all the time.
I have another comment on that.
Mhm.
Krishnamurti is always saying the observer and the observed cannot be separated. I don't know if he's a general semanticist either.
No, to my knowledge is not. But as the many quotations in general in Science and Sanity indicate, there was a lot of wisdom around before general semantics. And of course, Krzyzewski very openly and frankly points to the sources. Many of the things that he talked about he didn't claim as original with him by any means. What his claim to originality would be the synthesis that he made of all these things, putting them together in a teachable system.